Mitre attack solutions, update and evolution. A couple of housekeeping items as we put on before. Definitely the webinar is being recorded and will be available on our website for you to look. If there's any questions, please ask them in the Q&A section of the webinar site. So again, thanks very much for joining the webinar, Mitre Attack Solutions Update and Evolution. Always excited about this topic since it's a unique way of looking at your program. And with all the work the guys have done to make it useful, valuable, and actionable, pretty exciting to see what's going on with it and how you can actually use it in our program. My name is Stephen Marshowitz, Director of Program Development here at TrustedSec. And a little bit about us, TrustedSec, we really start with the most challenging aspect of security, understanding those real-world effectiveness of your security controls and against a skilled attacker using cutting-edge techniques. And really the company was founded on that principle to give you the most cutting-edge information to protect your security program. And so we build that into everything that we do. We take you through the full life cycle of security, from building with risk, program, and compliance reviews and readiness, testing, which is not only penetration testing, but cloud platform testing and customized testing, a lot happening there. And then fixing. We, about a year and a half ago now, we added remediation and optimization services. So we'll be rolling those out more and more all the time. We've had quite actually bit of interest in Office 365, which is actually another webinar coming up next month, and several services around that, as there's just been a lot of transition going there. And then finally, responding to any incidents that your program has. So that's a little bit about us. And again, with that, I will turn it over to our presenters, Rick Yoakum and Rocky Brockway. Rocky, take it away.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And everybody, thank you for taking the time out to join us. My name is Rocky Brockway. I am the practice lead for TrustedSec's Office of the CSO. I basically run our CSO Solutions Group. I have many years history in this particular industry. And my group primarily focuses in on helping organizations, really kind of bridge that gap between the technical security components of an organization with the business and leadership aspect of an organization. Since the reality of this is that the protection of business critical data really should be aligning with business need, business costs, things of that nature. And with me today is my very good friend, Rick Yoakum. Rick?
And that is me. Hey, everybody. Thanks for joining the webinar. I am a principal security consultant at TrustedSec. Prior to doing that fun stuff and helping a bunch of clients make their security programs better, I ran security programs at a handful of organizations. I've done the compliance stuff. I've also done more than my fair share of operational stuff. So I like to think that I bring a pretty broad set of perspectives to the things that we do. And I'm really excited to get to talk a little bit about how we're using the Mitre attack framework and where we're planning on, or thinking about taking the Mitre attack framework in a really, kind of effective operational way. There's some exciting stuff that they've done to the framework recently, which we'll get into, and some stuff that, that we're thinking on the horizon that's going to be fun to talk about.
Absolutely. So we're, like Rick mentioned, this is focused in on some of the updates and evolution of the Mitre attack framework. The first probably 10 to 15 minutes of this is maybe a little bit of a rehash for some people who have seen our previous webinar on the attack framework. But we're going to kind of reset the bar here just in terms of where we are today, and then get into what Mitre has done over the past year and where we're essentially looking to take the Mitre attack framework. So at a very high level, for anybody who's not familiar with the attack framework, Mitre has essentially organized the primary function of the attack framework is organizing known attack techniques by tactic. And within each of those tactics, within each of the techniques, there's a plethora of data that ends up being very valuable in the overarching attack process. And some of those things include data sources. Rick, would you like to maybe talk a little bit about the data source tie-in with all this?
Yeah, whenever whenever you really dig in to any specific technique, which is just, a thing that a bad guy or gal is going to try and do to harm your organization, there's a bunch of pieces of information. Data source is one of the ones that's particularly interesting to us in terms of running these evaluations, because it allows you to, maybe simplify a couple things. And at a high level, what a data source really is, if you're looking at one of these things, it's a comma separated list of, types of logs, more or less. And if you're looking at these types of logs or these types of things, you should be able to spot when an adversary is trying to do this bad thing. And at the heart of it, that's really how we connect a lot of the elements and make the Mitre attack framework operational, because there are a lot of different techniques, but there are far fewer data sources. So if you can really be thinking about the data sources that you're looking at, you can really start to drive through what you're going to be able to detect and prevent versus where you might have gaps in a much more efficient, much more effective way.
Sure. And part of the process of the attack path effectiveness solution that we've built here at TrustedSec is really working with organizations to initially just map, okay, what are your tools and what data sources do those tools actually have the ability to ingest and or have visibility into. That gives us a number of different kind of benefits. One being a very quick way to identify potential redundancies in tools. If you have multiple DLP solutions that are effectively all looking at the same data sources, is there really the need to have all three of those DLP solutions? Is that an opportunity to reduce cost? But the other primary aspect of this is really coverage, right? So Rick, explain a little bit about maybe this initial phase of what we're doing from a coverage perspective.
Yeah. So when we're looking at a technical environment and the defenses that environment has, there's sort of two sides to the equation. And the first thing we want to look at is really coverage, and that's just simply to say, do you have the right tools in place to actually stop these things from happening? And the way that we look at that is it's really a binary kind of assessment, a 1 or a 0, a true or a false. Would you be able to see or stop it if someone tried to do one of these things on the screen and beyond what's on this screen in the larger framework? The way that we kind of show clients that at a really high level is in sort of a heat map that looks like this. With greens and blacks. And the greens are things that, you have a tool in place, and if you are using it the way you should be using it, then you should have something in place that you could block or stop this sort of thing. But where there's not green, it's evidencing a place where, you might really want to think about whether or not it's okay that you don't have something in place to detect or prevent against this specific technique. Strategically, we use this a lot in figuring out, whether or not a security tool stack is, one, fully baked in terms of covering the stuff that should be covered, and then two, strategically aligned. Because one of the things that we find quite a bit, the attack framework itself is loosely based on sort of the Lockheed kill chain concept. And so there's a lot of different tactics that each technique is organized in. And if you can disrupt enough of those tactics at a high level, then you're breaking an attack to a large extent. So it might actually be okay if you have some coverage gaps, as long as you're approaching that strategically. And it's usually, the way that we think about this is, it's oftentimes better to have certain tactics, certain columns that have lots of black if other columns are very green. That can be okay, because it can be a strategic decision to focus a lot on, say, credential access versus discovery or privilege escalation. You don't necessarily have to focus on everything all at once. But at a high level, coverage really just is as simple as that. Is your current security tool set covering you against all the various bad things that are outlined in the Mitre attack framework?
And the one thing that, it is really kind of important to distinguish from is this is really the coverage aspect of this really is, best case scenario, right? These are the things that based on your tools, you should be able to detect, best case scenario. But that really then, begs the question, is that enough? And the answer logically is, if I go the right way, logically is no, right? Because there's a number of different other variables. Just because you have a particular tool and that tool is ingesting the data sources that should be able to detect a particular attack technique, that doesn't necessarily mean you will, because there are, effectiveness aspects to this entire kind of formula, right? So how well is that tool actually deployed? From a variable perspective, what we typically do is, kind of present people that we're working with in this type of engagement with the effectiveness variables that we've come up with, right? So some examples include deployment coverage, right? If you have an EDR, which typically has a really, high number of data sources that it has visibility into, and therefore is one of the more comprehensive types of tools available to teams. What if that tool is only deployed in your server farm, right? That's going to affect the maturity scoring of that particular effectiveness variable, deployment coverage, right? We have to lower that because it's only looking at a specific area of the organization. Change controls are also some of the other, another example of an effectiveness variable. Staff coverage. Do you have enough people monitoring this particular tool, or do you have enough experience with that particular tool from a talent perspective? We typically sit down with each of those kind of overarching subject matter teams. So let's say the endpoint team or the network security team or the identity team to kind of walk through, okay, let's talk about how well each of these teams feel that this particular tool is actually deployed and how effective they are at managing this tool. The other aspect, though, really also has to include, the detective SIM and SOC side of the house. Rick, you want to maybe talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah. So, it's kind of like if I think about a house, for instance, I have a set of outside doors to the house, and then, maybe I have a safe in that house. So there's different layers that, from a protective or detective perspective, things need to travel through. And if you have, it's one thing to say that, hey, we have these tools in place from a coverage perspective, and they're pretty effective. And chances are we would be able to detect if X, Y, Z were happening. Well, that's great, but you need to sort of reevaluate those effectiveness variables for your SEMs or your MSSPs, because anything practically that could go wrong from the data source to the tool that's collecting that information could also go wrong between the tool that's collecting that information and the tool that's aggregating that information. So it's absolutely necessary to think about each individual kind of log collection tool from an effectiveness perspective, but you really should be going a step further and thinking about your MSSPs, your SEMs, your SOCs to understand, okay, are there things that they are doing particularly well or challenges that they might have that might make it such that even if our tool stack detected something was going wrong, the processes and the people surrounding that tool stack would make it such that we don't respond appropriately.
Yeah, absolutely. Because at the end of the day, the skill set between, the skill set of actually managing a particular tool or suite of tools is a totally different skill set than, let's say, an analyst's ability to take in and take in various events and logs from different types of tools, and actually then correlate those vicarious different types of events into potential indicators of compromise. So there certainly is a blended kind of weighting that needs to kind of happen as you're looking at tool effectiveness as well as, we'll call it, aggregator effectiveness. And when you kind of find that balance, the proper balance for your organization, you end up getting a heat map that looks a little bit like this, right? So now we have a little bit more granularity just in terms of effectiveness. We're no longer looking at it from that binary yes or no coverage perspective, based on things like, how mature is your SOC or SIM team at correlating those types of different events for these particular types of tools that are actually sending their logs to a SIM. All of these now are blended into a weighted system, a weighted maturity system that gives us this effectiveness mapping. So from that, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
And the great thing about that in approaching it by giving different effectiveness scores to your individual tools in the aggregators themselves is it'll let you take a map like this and say, oh, well, I'm red for extra Windows memory injection, or I'm black in peripheral device discovery. How do I make those things better? And it'll allow you to focus the activities on the SEM versus the tool itself based on where your challenges exist.
Yeah. Yeah, like, maybe the tools that could detect those particular, let's say, lower maturity techniques within your effectiveness mapping, maybe adding an additional subject matter expert for that particular tool would boost that particular maturity score for that technique up. Or maybe it's a coverage issue. Maybe that just needs to be deployed further across the enterprise. But you have the ability now to really kind of plug and play in terms of like, what should this really look like, and how can we boost our maturity scores just based on the effectiveness kind of exercises that result in this type of mapping. Operationalizing this entire kind of engagement type, there's a number of things that you can really do on the operational side of the house. First and foremost, we can identify tools that have the most data source visibility, the most comprehensive tools within your suite of security tools. In this particular example, the Carbon Black Response EDR, it had more visibility into more data sources than a number of the other tools in this particular example. As in, what we can do with that is, the EDR ends up being the most comprehensive tool here in this particular example. But again, maybe it's only in a proof of concept. Yes, we have it, but it's only been deployed on a handful of endpoints. So its effectiveness ends up taking down the overarching effectiveness for the types of techniques that an EDR based on those data sources would be able to detect, inherently. So by identifying those tools that have visibility in the most data sources, we begin to have the ability to prioritize, let's say next steps in terms of boosting that maturity. Rick, you want to maybe talk about even new tools?
Yeah, new tools. The other way that we've found a lot of success in terms of clients using the Mitre framework, the Mitre attack framework, is in sort of that scenario planning, right? So, what if I add a new tool that does A, B, C? How does that impact my overall coverage map? How does it impact my overall effectiveness map based on some forecasting of how many resources we're going to throw at the thing? Or what if I get rid of some tools, right? What does that do to my scores? What if I and then on the effectiveness side as well, what if I add a new staff that's special, or 3 new staff that specialize in A, B, or C? Or what if I change my internal SOC to an MSSP, right? You can do all that scenario planning, and the Mitre framework itself is such a fantastic communication tool in a number of ways. You can then very easily see on heat maps kind of, okay, well, if we make this change, the environment in general is going to look and feel like this, but if we make this other change, we're going to have a lot more red or a lot more green, and be able to do some of that kind of scenario planning. And I just want to say really quickly, if this is the first Mitre attack webinar that you've seen us on, it's just worth calling out. We've done a couple other ones on this, and where we dig a lot deeper into sort of how we approach the engagements themselves, and how we kind of put the tool together. So if you're looking for nuts and bolts on that, I highly recommend, kind of going back into the archives and checking those out, because it'll give you a deeper picture than we're going to give you on this webinar in terms of how it all fits together. But in terms of, the usefulness you can pull from it, that scenario planning is absolutely huge. And then also even just being able to show, it's kind of like a scenario planning activity, effectively, but you can show what a high security zone looks like versus the general network, or what a DMZ looks like, right? So again, running these assessments separately for different zones with different security stacks can be a really effective way to show where you might be strong and where you might be weak in an existing environment.
And then another way to operationalize this is there are a number of vendors that after the fact, after new techniques or new attacks come out, and that actually brings up a really great point, is that again the Mitre attack framework is limited to known techniques, right? So this is an example of an attack chain that Microsoft published in a white paper last year, I believe, around the CVE 2018-2250 exploit. But you can see that, walking through that chain, starting with the email, spear phishing email, malicious macros, VBS, PowerShell, backdoor, et cetera, and then dropping payloads, we can actually now, once you walk through your own effectiveness on how well your organization really should look from an effectiveness perspective, we can overlay that. We can take those specific techniques that comprise that specific exploit and see, how well we actually stand up to those particular subcomponents of that particular attack itself. So again, another way of operationalizing something like this, this effectiveness, the coverage and effectiveness calculator. Let's talk groups. I don't think that we really dove into this in a lot of detail in a couple of our previous webinars, but one of the other areas that Mitre has been working on is documenting known threat actor groups. So that's a tough one, right? Attribution is hard, and B, a lot of this type of data, can get stale really quickly. But there's definitely a lot of value in being able to categorize and kind of get a better picture of what those threat actors actually are that may be targeting your industry, and what techniques that they've actually been seen to utilize in the wild. Rick, you maybe want to talk a little bit about that specific aspect of the attack framework in terms of groups.
Yeah, so each individual group, much like the techniques themselves, will have its own kind of page on the wiki that has a bunch of useful links to, techniques that they've been known to use, and the software that they've been known to use, which is also linked to its own techniques. That gives you, and it can give you a pretty good picture of, capabilities isn't necessarily the right word, but things that they've been seen to do in the wild. And I kind of think of this in the way that I think of like crime statistics for a city, right? Just because, a certain crime occurs quite a bit in a certain part of town, that's good information for me to have, because I want to make sure I'm reacting accordingly, right? Maybe it means I don't want to go to that part of town, or maybe it means I want to, modify my behavior. It doesn't necessarily mean that if I go to that part of town, it'll happen to me. It doesn't necessarily mean that next week will be the same as this week, but it does mean that it has happened in the past, and it's good to have awareness around that, because it can and probably should modify organizational behaviors and where you're focusing resources and things like that. If there are certain techniques that are widely used, often because they're easy, or often because organizations tend to have these vulnerabilities. Then you're going to want to make sure you're focusing on those things organizationally, so that you don't fall victim to some of those, most common techniques. The same way that, when you go to a certain part of the city, you don't want to fall victim to, kind of the most common types of, crimes that might be committed.
And we actually, in our risk assessments as well, we utilize this data a lot, from those purposes as well. Being able to kind of, sit down with an organization to understand what those critical systems are from a business perspective, but then taking a lot of this data and being able to then hand off to our technical penetration testing teams. Hey, here's this ERP system in this particular organization is super critical for production and tied to, half of their revenue. And there are these particular threat groups that are targeting this particular industry, and they have been seen to utilize these types of techniques and this type of software, in their campaigns. We should definitely simulate those for a more real world penetration test that then feeds into the overarching likelihood and impact calculations for a true risk assessment.
And if you have internal red teams and threat hunt teams, right, that's a very valid way to operationalize some of this data, right? Making sure that, they should absolutely be looking at a heck of a lot of stuff, but probably at a minimum, they should be looking at, some of those things that are known to be used quite frequently in the wild in the industries in which you exist.
Yep, absolutely. And then, the result really, from the attack path effectiveness perspective is now we can overlay, the actual effectiveness of many of these types of techniques that threat actor groups in the wild that target your industry are using with your actual effectiveness scores, just kind of help that prioritization over time as well. But there are certainly challenges to to a lot of this data that is in the in the Mitre attack framework related to groups. It's unorganized, and Rick, I'll hand this off to you because you did a lion's share of the manual kind of data gathering from a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, it's worth calling out. It is a treasure trove of good information. However, like Rocky said before, attribution is hard, and a lot of the information comes from a bunch of different sources. Mitre does a great job of pulling information from a ton of different sources, but where there's probably some room for additional maturity is organizing that information and parsing that information in such a way that it's a little easier to pull, a little easier to consume. There's several fields in there, such as description, which may or may not contain, for instance, industries that those groups have been known to target. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. But having that in a consistent place and maybe a field in and of itself, for example, would be a thing that would be lovely to pull. And I think a lot of, sort of threat hunt groups and red teams would love to be able to get their hands on that data quickly. So we did go through, we took a manual approach towards grabbing it because it was useful enough to get. And we've really, parsed through that data, and it really leaves us with a picture of, at least for the groups that are in attack and for the references that that Mitre lists at the bottom of each of those group pages. We kind of dug into each of those deep to say, okay, what are the types of targets that tend to be looked at in terms of industry, in terms of size, and we can pair that with the techniques themselves, and then we can get to a place where we understand a little bit more clearly, what actor groups are doing what and to whom, which is kind of that triad that we really want to be aware of so that we can prioritize defenses accordingly. So on the wiki itself, on the website itself, you can pull that data from those free text fields pretty easily. There's also, I think, a little bit of work that needs to be done on the in the STIX database as well, and that's probably a good place to throw it to you back to you, Rocky, to talk a little bit about the ATT&CK Python library.
Sure. Yeah. So we've done a bunch of work in trying to automate a lot of this stuff the best to the best of our capabilities. And first and foremost, shout out to Roberto Rodriguez. His initial threat hunting blogs around the attack framework and how to kind of manipulate that data in Excel was really kind of a starting point for us, as we've matured this over time. But his ATT&CK Python library has been just an incredible resource from an automation perspective. Being able to automatically go out, pull the latest database from the wiki site and manipulate all of that data to kind of to organize data sources, techniques, tactics, everything like that. Yeah, sure. There's still some things that we would love to see maybe connected a little bit more in some of that data, in some of those data structures. But at the end of the day, that work has been really, really helpful. But when, as Rick talked about doing a lot of that stuff manually, we did it live, right? So it was one of those things where, yeah, we can manually, every time there's new updates to some of this unorganized, quote unquote, unorganized data in the wiki site itself that maybe isn't as organized and available in the actual database and data structures that are available to pull down from the ATT&CK library or other Python libraries. But what we did then, and shout out to my Python savior, Justin Bollinger in TrustedSec. He worked with me to basically manually walk through a lot of these group pages on the Mitre attack site and manually scrape the different techniques for each group and the software for each group, helping kind of understand what the overlap is. Cobalt Strike may be looking at, or may have the ability to, perform 20 techniques, but there's also maybe a somewhat of an overlap in the other techniques that aren't necessarily categorized under that particular software. But, essentially what we did was through this whole process of both manual and as well as automation, we ended up putting together a calculator here that allows us to take a look at the specific industries and understand which groups are targeting those industries, and then as we'll see in a couple of more slides, what industries or what techniques those particular groups are also talking about or also targeting and utilizing. We ended up using the North American Industry Classification System, the NAICS classification system for industry classification. And as we walked through this entire process, we ended up with this calculator that, again, Rick, you did the lion's share of the initial of the initial calculator. Want to maybe walk through maybe some of that process with us?
Yeah, so I mean, to your point, it was essentially a scrape of the techniques that each group was using, and then understanding from a manual perspective which groups were targeting which NAICS codes, which industries. Once you have that, I mean, you sort of just follow that chain through, because group A uses these techniques to attack these industries, and then it's pretty easy to build out something that says, oh, okay, so if I flag utilities and mining, for instance, what's that new heat map look like in terms of the attacks that occur. And I should call out the Mitre attack framework has a lot of great information about what bad guys use what techniques, but it doesn't really talk too much about volume, at least not in a mechanical sense. So when we're talking about sort of the quote riskiest techniques, it tends to be aligned to the number of these large adversary groups that use them, or that use tools that have the capability to leverage these techniques, as opposed to the true volume of these techniques seen in the wild. If you're looking for something like the true volume of these techniques seen in the wild, you're probably going to need to begin to look beyond the Mitre attack framework. But just in terms of the adversary sets and what they tend to focus on, this gives you a really, really good sense of the techniques that many adversaries will go after. And really, like I said, it should be informing, how you're prioritizing defenses, how you're doing, red teaming, how you're looking at threat hunting. Not that you should isolate it to just those things, but particularly for organizations at the beginning of their journey or looking to overhaul, you really just want to make sure that the dark red techniques in this map are covered, because they're the ones where, the most groups have capabilities of taking advantage of them.
Yep, absolutely. So yeah, we end up with this breakdown by tactic and the techniques under each tactic, and waited for that particular industry that we chose on the previous slide, and illustrating which are the most commonly used techniques of those threat actor groups that are targeting that particular industry. So there's a lot of ways, and there's a lot of value here, kind of getting us all up to speed just in terms of where TrustedSec has kind of taken this, taken this to where we are today. There's certainly a number of valuable things for the technical side of the house, being able to prioritize that spend, having a common technical language. Threat modeling is a huge one. I've always been a fan of the Bruce Potter threat model. Actor performs action on asset for outcome because of motivation, right? So those five variables, which I probably should have illustrated if I was going to talk about it, but I didn't. But those five variables, the only one that Mitre attack framework really isn't at least somewhat touching upon is the asset itself, right? That's more of a business conversation to understand, what are the important assets and critical systems. But the actor, the action, the outcome, and even motivation to a certain degree really is covered, within the Mitre attack framework. On the business side, being able to prioritize the business spend and contributing to more precise decision making, and really kind of bridging that whole tech to business communication barrier that really continues to be a struggle for many organizations. Okay, so let's talk about where Mitre has just recently taken this. Rick, you want to maybe start out here?
Yeah, so they're constantly improving the attack framework. They do regular quarterly updates and their additional updates sort of ad hoc as things improve. But the most recent one, which was a big one, was introducing sub-techniques, and that impacts the framework in a number of ways. And there's a lot of good reasons why they did this, and I think that picture is a good indication of how both Rocky and I felt when they put this in place, because on the one hand, I'm really happy because in order to capture the appropriate granularity of techniques and to sort of help simplify a constantly expanding map of techniques, this makes a ton of sense. So it's a great change. But it did bring up a number of mechanical questions on how we're currently doing the assessments. And for those of you on the phone that are utilizing Mitre, right, there are probably some similar things that you're going to have to think through. So you want to hit the next one really quickly. And a lot of those things, they include these types of things, right? So the mechanics themselves, do we need to change how we're evaluating sub-techniques versus techniques? And, the spoiler alert is, probably not really. Sub-techniques are what they sound like, in that they inherit some, but not necessarily all of the data sources, and some, but not necessarily all of the platforms the parent technique has. So we can still kind of take the same high-level approach in terms of thinking about data sources, thinking about the effectiveness of a tool covering those data sources, and mapping that through. It does raise a question of partial coverage, however, right? Before we were talking about coverage, it was a very binary thing, right? Do we have a tool to cover a technique or not? Well, now I have the potential for a technique with 5 sub-techniques, and 3 of them are covered or 2 of them aren't. And so there's a little bit of geography and presentation layer stuff that we got to think through in terms of how we demonstrate when a parent technique is partially covered. The same thing kind of applies for effectiveness, right? How do you roll up the effectiveness of sub-techniques to sort of those parent techniques, right? On the one hand, the place where we always like to think about first is, oh, well, maybe I just average them. Okay, well, maybe, but that we really don't want to send the wrong impression here. So if, for instance, I have a parent technique that has 5 sub-techniques, and I'm perfect, I am maximally effective on 4 of those, but I have no coverage at all on 1 of them. And if that one that I have no coverage at all on happens to be a particularly highly used technique in terms of the groups that attack my industry, maybe showing 80% is not the right thing for that. I don't want to give a false sense of security. So again, presentation layer stuff, geography of where this stuff lives is super important, and implementing subgroups starts to change a lot of that stuff. You know, there's some, you know, and then that kind of all flows into the mechanics, but then they goes into the reporting adjustments themselves, you know, and how we go about demonstrating, you know, on a piece of paper or across several pages, you know, how good am I? How worried should I be, right? And, you know, at all the various levels, right? If I'm an executive, do I need to provide more funding? If I'm more operational, you know, where should I be focusing? It changes that kind of thing. And then the industry and group calculator itself, right? Where we have to re-walk and re-scrape that to understand where those hot spots remain based on the change to structure. And then the automation, you know, that Rocky touched on before, utilizing that Python library and the Stix database to automatically pull a lot of these things. I would think for any organization that's utilizing the attack framework in an operational manner, you're thinking about some or potentially all of these the same way that we are.
Yeah, and when we talk about that automation, you know, one of my biggest concerns was, oh, well, how much effort is it going to be for let's say me to go now and completely, you know, change the Python set of you know, scripts that I put together to adapt to, let's say, you know, just the subgroups themselves. And the reality is, it doesn't look like there's a lot of work, you know, just to kind of get the basic, just to continue the basic functionality of the way the actual database is set up. Because basically what we have now is for the parents, we still have that technique ID. And you can see in this particular example, the string for technique ID is T1055. That's a parent technique called process injection. There's then going to be, you know, in this particular example, 11 sub-techniques that are all example techniques of process injection. And each one of them now has a technique ID of the parent, and then the dot, let's say 001 or 002. So from that perspective, it ended up not being too much of a big challenge. It's still a work in progress, obviously. You know, this change with the sub techniques just went officially live. It's been in beta for a few months, but it went officially live last week. And so, you know, one of the benefits is that it reduced the overall number of techniques. That's really kind of been one of the critical, you know, one of the criticisms about about kind of utilizing the attack framework is that, okay, well, prior to this version that introduced sub techniques, there were 266 techniques. That's a lot of techniques. So now we're down to 156 either solo techniques or parent techniques, which is a nice little bit of reduction. But now we have 272 sub techniques, right? So there's a little bit of a balance there that we're still kind of working through, right? Again, this is going to be a little bit of a work in progress as we, you know, as we kind of adapt the automation to take into consideration these sub techniques. How are we going to present them? And as Rick said, you know, how does this affect the overarching mechanics of, you know, coverage and industry groups and reporting and things of that nature? Yeah. So, you know, Mitre has been really, really great at, you know, just kind of updating the framework and adding techniques and adding groups and this migration into the sub techniques. But there's a number of questions that we've been asking ourselves, right? For example, vulnerability scanners. Vulnerability scanners that's a really good example of a tool that is an important component of your security arsenal that technically doesn't actually map into any data sources, right? So Rick and I started talking about this just in terms of like, okay, well, of the what are those kind of like tool categories that are on the one hand, obviously important to an overarching security program, but on the other hand, don't necessarily directly map into data sources in the attack framework, right? So we kind of came down to these three categories, right? Vulnerability scanners, which also kind of includes static and dynamic code analysis tools. Those are really kind of more on the assessment / preparation side of the house, as opposed to what Mitre is really kind of, at least today, focusing on, which is protection and detection against known techniques. And mitigations, right? Mitigations. Where does proper network segmentation fall into? Those types of mitigations are, again, crucial to an overarching security program, but don't really technically map into the data sources themselves. Forensics tools, well, they actually do map into data sources, right? So let's say in case, as an example, as a forensic tool, that may have the ability to look at memory and look at all these other different types of data sources, but they're typically, and again, typically in quotes, they're typically used after the fact. So how do we kind of take into consideration a lot of these other aspects of a security program that may not necessarily map directly into the data sources that are super valuable from this coverage and effectiveness perspective, but should also be variables in an overarching program maturity aspect?
Yeah, and the only thing I would add is, like, we historically think of, the assessments that we do a lot, we think of it in terms of what are the preventative tools, right, that'll stop an attacker from being able to execute the attack, or what are the detective tools that'll show me if an attack is ongoing, and things like vulnerability scans, yeah, that happens before the fact, and things like forensic tools, yeah, those usually happen after the fact, and mitigations, yeah, I mean, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So we really had to think through our model, and while Mitre has been making their own kind of updates, we've really been thinking through what updates we want to be making on our end as well in parallel. And this is kind of starts to get into the evolution of where a lot of this stuff is going. And when we think about it from the kind of risk mitigation, it's all risk mitigation, but I think of like proactive risk mitigation via things like architecture. What's an example of this that's not already a mitigation in Mitre? Something along the lines of, well, if all my endpoints are part of a VDI infrastructure, and if that VDI infrastructure kind of wipes and refreshes all of the endpoints after they're used, or after a session, is reset, well, there's a lot of techniques in the persistence tactic that I probably don't need to worry about anymore. And so it minimizes the risk. It's not a detective tool, it's not a preventative tool, but it is kind of a process that really drops the risk significantly of some of those techniques. And then on the other side, right, on the tools side, things like vulnerability scanners that, they certainly do map directly to techniques. I want vulnerability scanners, and different vulnerability scanners will map to different techniques. If I'm doing, sort of an app vuln suite or app vuln scan versus a network vuln scan, they're different things. I'm looking at different things. But I want to make sure that I have equally important, processes in place to improve the defensive tools that I have in place, those defensive and protective tools. But they don't really map into those direct defenses. So we kind of thought about this, and we're calling it sort of an assess domain with, the process side, which is kind of some of those controls that we talked about, not specific mitigations that are already in Mitre, but other architectural controls that help minimize your attack surface or your risk. And then the tool side of things, which, kind of maximize the value of those defensive and preventative tools that you have in place. After that, we kind of think about, okay, great, that's sort of the before stuff. What about during an attack? My actual defenses, while an attack is happening. Okay, well, prevent and detect, we kind of have that in pretty good shape today. That's really where, where we started a lot of this stuff. But one thing that we hadn't looked at a ton in the past is the mitigations that exist in Mitre. And there's a bunch, I think it's like 41 today, mitigating controls that apply, and they have links to specific techniques. And there's, I think, a lot of value here, but we need to do a little bit of work to unlock that value in a meaningful way. And you know, for instance, the browser execution technique has 4 listed mitigations: audits, training, execution prevention, and installation restrictions. And while all of these are important, you know, I would argue that audits and training are going to be less effective as a true defense when an attack is occurring. They can certainly be helpful, but they're less effective than those crunchier controls like execution prevention and installation prevention. So we're thinking through how we take a spin through these mitigations and probably ascribe some level of, you know, value that'll mitigate some additional risk associated with the individual techniques. And then we're going to want to overlay that with the preventative tools and with the detective tools, because, you know, sometimes those mitigations will completely make it so an attacker just can't use that technique anymore. And if that's the case, maybe it's completely fine you don't have a preventative or detective tool around it. Or vice versa. Maybe that mitigation helps to limit, truly mitigate some of that technique, but it doesn't completely stop it. And so we're thinking through currently as some of our next steps, how we're going to be layering those mitigations in with the current stuff that we have in our assessments in terms of prevention and detection. And that's sort of the detect domain. And then there's this whole, you know, after the fact, you know, set of things, the respond domain. And this is where it really starts to tie into IR stuff. And, you know, there's a set of tools, right? These forensic tools that do a fantastic job of limiting risk in a number of ways, right? They limit risk by helping you understand what's happening during an attack and allowing you to isolate systems in such a way that, you know, that attack can't continue or expand. They also minimize risk kind of on the commercial side by not destroying evidence, right? Collecting evidence that might be used in court or might be used in terms of cyber liability insurance providers to prove that you've done the right things. And again, these do map directly to data sources because often they're, you know, really heavily invested in looking at logs, looking at the activities that have occurred on a system, but they don't directly stop or directly identify a new attack. They're really responsive in nature, but still very valuable to understand how they're mitigating risks once an attack has been successful or once the initial steps of an attack have been successful. And again, much like the assess category, there's kind of a tool side to this and then a process side to this. And the process side is pretty, you know, standard fare for most assessments, but you're really thinking through kind of the plans, the partnerships that are in place in terms, but doing that in terms of Mitre, right? So for instance, if you have very well-defined, you know, execution standards and response playbooks that really help you isolate systems rapidly, we can, you know, you minimize some of the back-end risks in some of those tactics. And similarly, for some of those commercial agreements that you might have in place, cyber liability insurance, for instance, assuming, you know, you've done the footwork to make sure it's going to pay out in the appropriate scenarios, it can really limit the risks associated with the impact tactic or the exfiltration tactic. So, you know, understanding how that, again, you know, plays with respect to your defensive tools, maybe I can afford to have less scanning and less prevention if, you know, I have some of these commercial agreements in place, or maybe not. Maybe I want complete defense in depth there, but having that data will allow you to make those sort of strategic decisions, that cost benefit analysis. So, you know, that's kind of what we're thinking in terms of new stuff to our model. Just a word of caution before we see it all on a page, you know, it's all subject to change. We're thinking through this actively but we feel like it's the right time to be working through these questions because, as we mentioned before, with the sub-techniques, we're working through a lot of these changes already. So we want to make sure we're positioning ourselves to continue to make this better. So what's it look like on a page? Well, we kind of have this assess, defend, and respond domain, and then kind of how we think about, what's in place, what the high effort extensions to that model are, and what the lower effort and the higher effort extensions that those models are. This is kind of how it feels. And the main thing is it's, what do you have today? What can you rapidly expand upon based on the model? And then, what's going to be harder because there are a lot more mechanical considerations. And really when you start to blend in the process side of things, those architectural considerations or those commercial plans and partnerships that probably apply to whole tactics and figuring out the appropriate way to layer those with your defenses, that'll be, I think, a difficult thing to sort of think through, but it'll be highly important. But there's no reason that organizations couldn't start thinking about their vuln scanners, thinking about their forensic tools, thinking about those mitigation controls within their current models.
Yeah, and just to kind of add as we finish up this slide and get into any questions that anybody has, just to kind of put a point to the whole kind of process from my perspective. This, as we begin to branch out perhaps a little bit beyond the specific MITRE ATT&CK framework as it applies to techniques, data sources, tactics, and the preventative detective type associations, getting into more of that assess and respond and the process aspects of all of this really, really are going to help in the long run organizations be able to, again, kind of back to one of the original challenges here that we pointed out, and really going to assist in that bridge, that communications gap between the technical side of the house and the business side of the house. They typically, leadership typically doesn't speak the technical languages, and in many instances, vice versa. Being able to put together a model that incorporates all these different aspects, from the very, very technical, tactical aspects of the MITRE ATT&CK framework to the resulting business ramifications in terms of effort and cost and prioritization. All of that, in my mind, has a ton of value for organizations. Rick, any last thoughts before we move over into questions?
No, for me, this is directionally, with this and the sub techniques, this is, where we're hoping to begin to drive this and begin to blend it. So,
absolutely.
I think let's get some questions.
Yeah. So for, we have a couple of minutes to the 2 o'clock hour, but Rick and I are happy to extend that if anybody, has additional time and would like to have us, or like to throw some questions towards us.
Yep, we got quite a few of them. Everyone seemed to use the chat instead of questions, but that's fine. First one is, are measures of effectiveness 0 or 1 or 1 through 5? Would a 0 or 1 mean it allows or prevents an attack? So 0 meaning allows, 1 meaning prevents.
Yep, no, that's a great question. Effectiveness, the way we have built the model, the effectiveness scores are 1 through 5, more of that CMMI maturity model. So 1 being, let's say, poor, 5 being excellent. And the 0 or 1 binary stuff is really more on the coverage side. So that phase 1, mapping the tools, the data sources, and best case scenario, you either should or should not be able to detect these particular techniques based on your security inventory, your tool inventory. That's where the binary 0 and 1 is really applicable. The effectiveness is definitely much more of a maturity model.
Yeah. So if you're asking the question, do I have a tool to stop or to see a specific technique? That's usually a yes or no question. How well am I using that tool is usually more of a scaled question. So we use CMMI for that.
Okay, great, thanks. Attack seems to be Windows centric. Is that true? And can it be applied to non-Windows as well? So
I would say that the lion's share of the techniques out there are absolutely applicable to the Windows platform. But you can also take a look at that from the perspective of market share, right? Windows happens to have 92 or 93% of the actual operating system market share. So as an attacker, if I'm looking at my business model, I'm certainly I'm likely going to be targeting organizations that have the most commonly deployed operating system out there, which ends up being Windows. Now, ATT&CK is certainly not limited to Windows. There are 9 platforms today, Linux, Macintosh, Windows, and then they added 6 cloud platforms, Rick. And I'm not probably going to stumble on all 6 of those, but Rick, from your perspective, any additional input from there?
No, completely. Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. You can slice it and dice it, and each of the techniques has the operating systems, or they call it platforms, but the platforms that are applicable to it outlined. And so we take that into account in our assessments, right? If you have no Linux in your environment, or you have only Linux in your environment, we're not going to talk about all the Windows stuff. We can kind of throw a lot of that out. The only thing I would add, though, in terms of the platforms which are covered is, we primarily focus on the enterprise attack framework. There is also a mobile attack framework, which also includes iOS and Android. It's slightly less mature, I would say, but it is being worked on by Mitre consistently. So yeah, a lot of the techniques are Windows techniques, but they are all mapped to Linux, iOS, Windows, and then all the cloud stuff, and then there's a whole separate table essentially, or framework for the mobile stuff.
Yeah, so it's like AWS, Google Cloud Platform. There's Azure AD, and I'm forgetting a couple, but yeah.
Yep. Yeah. So they're in there.
Okay, great. Explain. You mentioned lower maturity techniques. Could you explain that? And does that mean with an unknown threat and an unknown vulnerability?
If it was me that said lower maturity techniques, then I likely misspoke. Typically, when we're talking about maturity, it's lower maturity around the effectiveness of the tool, and the effectiveness of the tool will then result in perhaps a lower maturity around the specific techniques. But realistically, we're looking at the tools themselves. If your EDR, again, let's just say that it's only deployed in a server farm, then through the data sources that the EDR has visibility into, then all of the techniques that the EDR should be able to detect will have a lower maturity score just based on the fact that that tool's effectiveness is low. So if that was me, I apologize. I didn't necessarily mean to call it a lower maturity technique. It's really the maturity related to the tool, and then the resulting scoring related to those techniques. I hope that answered the question.
I completely agree with that, Rocky. I was thinking the same thing. Oh, if I said that, then I must have misspoke, because we're talking about the maturity that an organization has in its ability to prevent or detect an individual technique. The other, we don't really, as far as this assessment goes, we don't really take into consideration how difficult any individual technique is. It's not really part of Mitre directly, although through a couple hops to other frameworks, you can start to get people's assessments of that. But where I think we account for some of that stuff, right, is that oftentimes how frequently an attack is used in the wild can be kind of correlated to how easy, right, the costs associated with actually, the costs associated with actually executing that technique by an adversary group, right? So if it takes a lot of technology or a lot of knowledge to execute a specific technique, we tend to see it utilized in the wild slightly less than those techniques which are very easy to use. So that industry and group mappings, that sort of danger heat map that we threw up earlier, although it doesn't directly talk about the difficulty of an attack, there's probably an inherent and unscientific correlation between some of that stuff.
Yeah, and a great example of that, if you actually start walking through a lot of the threat actor group documentation in the attack wiki, you'll see that a lot of the attack groups utilize, let's say, PowerShell Empire, right? And PowerShell Empire then has a suite of attack techniques that are common to it natively. Because PowerShell Empire, again, just as an example, is a fairly common and easily, it's an open source tool. You can download it, blah, blah, blah. Those associated techniques end up being more common than not, irrespective of industry.
Right. But so when we're talking about, difficulty or maturity associated with a specific technique, I wouldn't say we look at it directly, but there might be an indirect link to it through what's utilized the most in the wild by the groups in the attack framework.
Okay, great. Just a couple more. How have conversations with IT and security execs gone? Do you have to explain first, or how would you start those conversations?
That's a great question. At the end of the day, there's a lot of metrics that we can provide that comes out of this particular, the calculator that we've built, between the effectiveness of the teams and, the groups and industries that they target. But at the end of the day, you do have to be careful in overloading any, executive with technical metrics, right? So that, really where this kind of assessment, which is super, super valuable to the technical teams, the value to the business leadership side of the house really is illustrating, the heat maps from the effectiveness perspective. And then as a result of, let's say, gaps or lower maturity areas, being able to illustrate, well, if we do this, if we add, if we add spend to, let's say, training in this particular tool, or we add our license count to this particular tool because it's only deployed in a certain area, then that will visually improve the actual effectiveness heat map accordingly. So the combination of kind of picking and choosing your let's say business layer metrics that come out of this, but also being able to illustrate, the actual effect that these asks from a budget perspective would entail, then that ends up being super, super valuable. And we've seen technical teams have a lot of success in effectively communicating that to leadership and then getting that spend.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really about being able to communicate current state, being able to communicate kind of desired direction, and knowing your audience, right? We have some executive audiences that we interact with that are highly technical because they like to be in the weeds because that's where they came from. And they love seeing sort of the full heat map oftentimes, and they'll ask very pointed questions. There are other, sort of executive teams or boards that we'll talk to that, they really just kind of want to see the red, yellow, green, and, where you can start rolling up into specific tactics to demonstrate that can be really valuable for those individuals that just want to see, okay, look, an attack often consists of these, 11, or some combination of these 11 steps. We're really good at stopping these steps that are in this grouping. We're not so good at steps in this grouping and we need to get better, or we're not so good at steps in this grouping and that's okay because ... And you can really effectively utilize this to drive those conversations in a way that is often useful for executive and board presentations. Because even if you don't start in the weeds, if they start asking, questions, you can have that full heat map in an appendix, and you can dig even deeper into, how you kind of reviewed against individual tools and how much coverage you have and all that good stuff. But generally, this is a fantastic tool for communications, particularly for organizations that are trying to understand strategically where they want to go with their defensive tool set and their defensive controls, and for dealing with some of those financial conversations around, what happens if I add people versus add tools versus do nothing.
Great. Just a couple more. One, if I wanted to implement this, what would be my first steps? Where exactly would I start? Is there a Mitre for dummies, for example? Lots of laughs.
There probably should be a Mitre for dummies. I don't know. I mean, what do you think, Rick? I mean, obviously you can contact us, but clearly this is, the Mitre attack framework is an open source framework. So if you just wanted to go and utilize the Python library to download everything and create your own stuff, you certainly can. But in terms of the actual first steps around this. I would say that it's probably the initial value that I found when I first discovered the Mitre attack framework was really, walking through the wiki page of the enterprise matrix and diving into each of the techniques to really kind of understand, okay, what are they really talking about? So credential, dumping credentials or something like that. The data sources are these 4 data sources that could potentially detect that. Well, what does that actually mean, right? And kind of like walking through yourself, just, what they have documented, but then really kind of, taking the time to understand why these things were organized in this particular manner. That was the most valuable thing for me initially.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think if it were me and I had no experience with this, and I'm assuming, everyone is in a resource conscious environment, but, assuming you're an army of one or an army of a few, the way I would go about starting this is actually kind of similar to the way that I would explain it to executives to a large extent, is I would go to the web. Well, I wouldn't present it this way to executives, but how I think about it is the same way. So if I were you, I would go to the website. I would go to the tactics dropdown. I would click enterprise, and you'll see a listing of what I think are like 11 enterprise tactics at a really high level. And they're just very broad, bad things that can happen, right? Initial access, the adversary is trying to get into your network. Execution, the adversary is trying to run malicious code. Before diving way down into the individual techniques, I'd think about these tactics at a high level, and I'd say, okay, initial access. Do I have controls in place for this, or is this even a risk to my organization, right? One of them is exfiltration, right? The adversary is trying to steal data. Well, if you work in an organization, maybe it's a manufacturing environment, and you don't have a ton of very secret, sensitive intellectual property, maybe that one doesn't scare you as much. You just want to make sure that your legal stuff and your HR stuff, stays secret and doesn't go anywhere. So I would walk it kind of tactic by tactic at a high level. Think about the tools you have in place. Think about the controls you have in place. And think about where strategically you want to invest more time, or where you might have too much coverage, or where you have a whole lot of risk. And once you feel kind of good about that assessment, I'd take it a level deeper and start thinking about the techniques themselves that live within each one of these tactics. And that's probably an easy and effective way to start to think through how this thing's designed and some of the value it can provide.
Okay, one last one. Compare this to a red team exercise or a purple team. Would you recommend doing this alongside one of those instead of, or just those are completely separate?
So my opinion on this is that it's really more of a maturity question than anything else, right? Let's take a look at organizations that may be looking at a purple team engagement, but I don't know, they don't really have they don't have let's say a SIM team. Is that organization really ready for a purple team? And if that maturity is maybe not quite ready, maybe that organization isn't quite ready for a real purple or defensive blue team engagement, just from their maturity perspective, then this is certainly, another aspect of, I talk about looking at an overarching security program from different angles, right? This is certainly a different angle to look at your security program if you're maybe not quite ready for that red, purple, or blue team engagement. Now, I will say that, this is not a substitute. This is not a substitute for red teaming, purple teaming, or blue teaming, right? This is an added way to look at an engagement. There are certainly overlap in terms of those types of technical assessments. I won't get into those details, but yeah, sure, there are definitely overlaps in terms of what this type of Mitre attack effectiveness assessment can provide versus any one of those types of technical assessments. But at the end of the day, they're different. And it's really, in my mind, a question of how mature the organization is and what the priorities are in terms of how you're looking at your program. You could be also really mature and be doing purple teaming and still get a lot of value out of this. And the vice versa is also true. But it's, again, it's a different way to look at the program.
Yeah, it is 100% not a replacement. And I do think there's a ton of value in aligning an assessment like this, that's Mitre aligned if your red teams, purple teams are utilizing Mitre as a communication mechanism. This can add tons of value, provide another layer of depth against those types of assessments. But ultimately, you don't need to be doing red teaming to get value out of this. And this does not provide you the same value that a red teaming exercises or purple teaming exercises would provide.
Yep.
Okay, great. Well, thank you guys. I wanted to really thank everyone who joined, and obviously especially Rocky and Rick. Thank you so much for all of the valuable information.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for hanging out with us.
And with that, we will conclude. Thanks again. Have a great day.
Thanks. Take care.
Take care.